My phone buzzed at 2:30 in the morning, jolting me awake in my Seattle apartment. The caller ID showed my boss's name and my stomach immediately twisted into knots. Richard never called this late unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. I answered groggily, still half asleep, completely unprepared for what would change my entire life. His voice was frantic, almost desperate, as he explained that our biggest client's project in Singapore was falling apart and threatening to bankrupt the company. The previous team had fled the country after discovering massive technical failures that could cost us $12 million. He needed me on a plane within 18 hours to salvage what remained of the disaster. The promise of a promotion and substantial bonus made my heart race with excitement, finally believing this assignment would prove my worth after years of watching less qualified male colleagues advance past me. The Singapore humidity hit me like a wall when I stepped off the plane at Changi Airport. My body clock was completely scrambled, and I had barely slept during the 20-hour journey, but there was no time to adjust. Richard's assistant had texted me the address of Megacorp Asia's headquarters while I was still in customs, along with a curt message that the client meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. The taxi ride through Singapore's gleaming downtown gave me my first glimpse of the magnitude of this assignment. Megacorp Asia's building towered 43 stories above the Marina Bay district, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of corporate power. This wasn't just any client. They were one of the largest financial services companies in Southeast Asia, and losing them would devastate TechFlow Solutions. Inside the marble lobby, security guards directed me to the 37th floor where I met David Chen, Megacorp's chief technology officer. His expression was stone cold as he led me into a conference room filled with 8 executives, all looking like they wanted to throw me off the balcony. The previous project manager had apparently vanished 3 weeks ago, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and a system that crashed every 12 hours. Miss Florence, David said, his accent crisp and professional, your company has been paid $4.2 million over the past 8 months. We have received exactly 0 functioning deliverables. Our patience is completely exhausted. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing documentation that made my blood run cold. The previous team had submitted weekly progress reports claiming 80% completion, but when I accessed the actual servers, I found maybe 15% of the work had been done correctly. Worse, the code that did exist was so poorly written that it would need to be completely rebuilt from scratch. My hotel room that night felt like a prison cell. I video called Richard around midnight Singapore time, explaining the true scope of the disaster. His face went pale as I described the falsified reports and the massive amount of work required to salvage the project. Florence, I need you to understand something, he said, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard before. This project cannot fail. Do whatever it takes to make this work. I don't care if you have to work around the clock for the next month. The next morning brought my first real shock. Jake Morrison, my supposed teammate who had flown out with me, knocked on my hotel room door at 7 a.m. with his suitcase packed. His face was flushed with embarrassment as he explained that headquarters had suddenly reassigned him to the Portland office for an urgent priority project. I'm really sorry, Florence, he said, avoiding eye contact. I know this leaves you in a tough spot, but orders came down from the C-suite. I have to catch the next flight back. Standing alone in that hotel hallway watching Jake disappear into the elevator, I felt the first real stab of abandonment. In 15 years of corporate work, I had never been left to handle a project of this magnitude completely solo, especially not in a foreign country where I knew absolutely nobody. The local contractors Megacorp had hired to assist with implementation were equally challenging. Most spoke limited English, and the few who were fluent seemed more interested in covering their own involvement in the previous failures than actually helping solve problems. The only exception was Wei Zhang, a soft-spoken systems architect in his early 30s, who stayed late that first week to walk me through the technical architecture. Miss Florence, he said quietly as we reviewed the server logs at 8 p.m. on my fourth day. Something feels wrong about how your company is handling this situation. In my experience, American firms never send just one person for projects this complex. I worked 18-hour days trying to reverse engineer what the previous team had actually built versus what they claimed to have delivered. The deeper I dug, the more evidence I found of systematic deception. Database tables that were supposed to contain customer transaction data were completely empty. Security protocols that were marked as implemented and tested existed only in documentation, not in the actual code. By the end of my second week, I had managed to build a basic framework that could handle simple transactions without crashing, but I was nowhere near the sophisticated system Megacorp had paid for. My body was running on caffeine and determination, and I was using my personal credit card to pay for meals because my company card kept getting declined for international restrictions. The real betrayal came when I discovered a hidden folder on one of the development servers. Inside were email exchanges between the previous project manager and someone at a competing software company called Next Gen Solutions. The messages revealed a kickback scheme where my colleague had been deliberately sabotaging the project while feeding proprietary information to our competitor. My hands literally trembled as I read through months of coordination between my own company's employee and external parties designed to ensure Megacorp's project would fail spectacularly. The plan was for Next Gen Solutions to swoop in as the rescue vendor after TechFlow's inevitable collapse, having already gained intimate knowledge of Megacorp's requirements through industrial espionage. That night, I called Richard with my discoveries, expecting shock and immediate action to address the corruption. Instead, he listened silently before responding in a flat, emotionless tone that made my stomach drop. Florence, I need you to focus on delivering results, not creating conspiracy theories. Your job is to make this project work and to investigate what happened before you arrived. The dismissal in his voice was so complete, so absolute, that I realized something much darker was happening. Richard had known about the corruption. He had sent me to Singapore not to save the project, but to become the scapegoat when everything inevitably collapsed. The realization that I had been set up to fail consumed my thoughts as I threw myself even deeper into the work. If they expected me to be their scapegoat, I was determined to prove them wrong by actually succeeding against impossible odds. My hotel room became a secondary office with laptops and documentation covering every surface as I worked from 5 a.m. until midnight every single day. 3 weeks into the assignment, my company credit card was permanently declined while I was trying to pay the local contractors. The rejection happened during a team meeting with 5 Megacorp employees, watching as the payment terminal repeatedly flashed, "Transaction denied," in bright red letters. The humiliation burned through me as I awkwardly pulled out my personal American Express card to cover the $8,000 invoice. When I called TechFlow's accounting department, the response was even more infuriating. Jennifer from finance informed me that my card had been temporarily restricted due to unusual international spending patterns, and that resolving the issue required approval from 3 different department heads who were all currently unavailable. "How long does this approval process typically take?" I asked, calculating how much of my personal savings I would need to advance to keep the project moving. "There's no standard timeline," Jennifer replied with bureaucratic indifference. "It could be a few days or several weeks, depending on their schedules. I was forced to use my personal funds to pay contractors, buy software licenses, and cover development expenses that should have been company responsibilities. My savings account dwindled from $15,000 to $6,000 in a matter of days, but I was determined not to let financial manipulation derail the progress I was finally making. My requests for additional team members were met with increasingly creative excuses. The first week, Richard claimed budget constraints. The second week, he cited resource allocation challenges. By the third week, he stopped responding to my staffing requests entirely, leaving me to handle database architecture, user interface design, security, implementation, and project management completely alone. The isolation became even more pronounced during Chinese New Year week, when Singapore essentially shut down for celebrations. While my TechFlow colleagues posted photos of their vacation trips to Cancun and Aspen on the company's internal social media, I spent the holiday working alone in an empty megacorp office building, sustained by convenience store noodles and sheer determination. Wei was the only person who seemed to recognize the absurdity of my situation. During one of our late-night debugging sessions, he pulled up a chair beside my workstation and spoke with unusual directness. "Florence, I have worked with many American technology companies over the past 10 years. I have never seen a firm send a single person to handle a project worth millions of dollars. This is not normal business practice." His observation crystallized something I had been trying to ignore. TechFlow Solutions was deliberately sabotaging my ability to succeed, while simultaneously positioning me to take responsibility for the failure. The corruption scandal involving the previous team was bad enough, but my company's response suggested they were actively participating in the cover-up. Despite the complete lack of support, I managed to achieve what felt like a miracle. Working with Wei and 2 local contractors, I rebuilt 60% of the system from scratch, implementing security protocols, designing user interfaces, and creating database structures that actually functioned as intended. The new code was clean, efficient, and thoroughly tested, representing thousands of hours of focused effort. Megacorp's executives began expressing cautious optimism about the project's direction. David Chen, who had been openly hostile during my first week, started scheduling daily check-ins to review progress and provide feedback. The transformation in their attitude gave me hope that success might actually be possible. That hope was shattered when I accidentally intercepted an email that was clearly intended for Richard's eyes only. The message came from Patricia Williams, TechFlow's head of legal affairs, with the subject line, "Singapore Project Exit Strategy, Confidential." The contents made me physically nauseous. Patricia had prepared termination documents, legal briefs blaming me for project mismanagement, and a comprehensive strategy for shifting all liability onto my shoulders. The plan included firing me after 30 days and claiming that my poor leadership and technical incompetence had caused the project to fail, despite the corruption evidence that clearly demonstrated systemic problems predating my involvement. The email also revealed that TechFlow was prepared to sacrifice the megacorp relationship entirely, having already begun negotiations to sell the company to a private equity firm that would liquidate assets and eliminate the Singapore obligations. My success or failure was irrelevant to their ultimate strategy. They simply needed someone to blame while they executed as their exit plan. Reading that email in the fluorescent light of my hotel room at 2 a.m., I felt something inside me break and reshape itself into something harder and more focused. They had sent me 12,000 miles from home, isolated me from any support, drained my personal finances, and positioned me to be destroyed professionally, all while I worked myself to exhaustion, trying to salvage their reputation. The next morning, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. The idealistic employee who had believed in company loyalty and hard work was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival required strategic thinking rather than naive dedication. Fueled by anger and determination, I threw every ounce of energy into completing the project ahead of schedule. If TechFlow wanted to use me as a scapegoat, they would have to do it after I had delivered undeniable success that would make their betrayal obvious to everyone involved. I worked through exhaustion, through doubt, and through the growing realization that I was completely on my own. The breakthrough came during my 4th week, when I finally solved the integration challenges that had plagued the project for months. The system that the previous team had declared impossible to implement was actually achievable once you understood the underlying architecture properly. Working with Wayway managed to create a seamless connection between Megacorp's legacy databases and the new transaction processing engine. By day 26, I had successfully completed 85% of the project restoration. The system could handle complex financial transactions, generate real-time reports, and maintain security protocols that exceeded industry standards. It was better than what Megacorp had originally contracted for, built entirely from scratch in less than a month by someone who was supposedly incompetent. David Chen was genuinely impressed during our final review meeting. Florence, I must admit that when you arrived, I had very little faith that this project could be salvaged. What you have accomplished is remarkable, especially considering the circumstances. Other Megacorp executives began expressing interest in expanding their relationship with TechFlow for future projects. They asked about my availability for upcoming initiatives and whether I could recommend additional team members with similar capabilities. The irony was devastating. My company was planning to destroy me just as I was generating the most valuable client relationship in TechFlow's history. I spent 2 days preparing a comprehensive presentation documenting every aspect of the rebuilt system. The slides detailed the technical challenges I had overcome, the security improvements I had implemented, and the performance benchmarks that exceeded original specifications. I included testimonials from Megacorp's technical team and financial projections showing the value they would derive from the new system. The presentation was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 a.m. Singapore time, with Richard and the executive team joining via video conference from Seattle. This was supposed to be my triumphant moment, the proof that I could handle impossible challenges and deliver extraordinary results despite being abandoned and undermined. I arrived at Megacorp's conference room 30 minutes early to set up the technical demonstrations. The new system was performing flawlessly, processing test transactions with lightning speed and generating reports that impressed even Wei, who had seen every stage of the development process. At exactly 10 a.m., I began presenting to 12 executives spread between Singapore and Seattle. For the first 15 minutes, everything went perfectly. I walked through the technical architecture, demonstrated key functionality, and showed performance metrics that exceeded all expectations. The faces on the video screen from Seattle looked genuinely surprised by the quality of what I had delivered. Then my laptop screen went black. At first, I thought it was a simple technical glitch, maybe an overheating issue from running multiple applications simultaneously. I pressed the power button and waited for the system to restart, making small talk about Singapore's weather while the machine went through its boot sequence. But when the login screen appeared, my company credentials were rejected. The system informed me that my account had been disabled by administrator and provided a phone number for technical support. Confused, I tried logging in again with the same result. My phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was Richard, and the message contained exactly 13 words that destroyed my world. "We're going to fire you. Effective immediately. Company ID disabled. You're on your own." I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief, while 12 executives watched me struggle to comprehend what was happening. My laptop was completely locked, my access to company systems was terminated, and I was sitting in a conference room 12,000 miles from home with no corporate backing and no way to complete the presentation I had spent weeks preparing. The humiliation was complete when Megacorp's security team arrived 5 minutes later with a request to collect Aral company property. They had received a formal notification from TechFlow's legal department instructing them to secure laptops, documentation, and access credentials immediately. The security guards were polite but firm as they packed up my equipment while the executives watched in stunned silence. David Chen's expression shifted from confusion to anger as he realized what was happening. "Florence, can you explain what is occurring here? We are in the middle of reviewing a project that appears to be nearly complete." I stood in that conference room surrounded by people who had come to respect my work and tried to find words to explain that my own company had just abandoned me in the middle of a successful presentation. The professional humiliation was devastating, but the personal betrayal cut even deeper. "I apologize," I said, my voice somehow steady despite the chaos in my mind. "It appears that TechFlow has terminated my employment during our meeting. I will need to contact my former employer to understand the situation." The walk from Megacorp's office to the elevator was the longest 30 seconds of my professional life. Behind me, I could hear confused conversations as executives tried to understand how an American company could fire someone in the middle of a successful project presentation. The elevator doors closed, and I found myself alone with the devastating reality of my situation. I was stranded in Singapore with no company support, no access to my work, and no clear path home. My personal savings were nearly depleted. From covering project expenses, my health insurance had probably been canceled, along with my employment, and my apartment lease back in Seattle would default if I couldn't make next month's rent payment. Standing on the sidewalk outside Megacorp's building, holding my personal belongings in a small box while taxis rushed past in the tropical heat, I realized that TechFlow had executed their plan perfectly. I was isolated, financially vulnerable, and professionally humiliated, exactly as they had intended. The first night after being fired was the darkest period of my professional life. I sat in my Singapore hotel room staring at the city lights through the window while trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I struggled to understand how I had missed the warning signs. My phone kept buzzing with notifications that made everything worse. First, an automated email informed me that my health insurance coverage had been terminated retroactively to the beginning of the month, meaning I was potentially liable for thousands of dollars in medical expenses if anything happened while I was overseas. Then, my bank sent an alert that my direct deposit had been reversed, taking my most recent paycheck back and leaving my account dangerously low. The worst notification came from my apartment complex in Seattle. An automated message explained that my rent payment had been declined due to insufficient funds, and I now had 10 days to resolve the issue before facing eviction proceedings. The financial devastation was happening faster than I could even comprehend. I tried calling Richard multiple times, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When I called TechFlow's main number, the receptionist informed me that I was no longer an employee and couldn't be connected to any staff members. The same company where I had worked for 6 years suddenly treated me like a stranger who had no right to speak with anyone in management. The emotional impact was even worse than the financial crisis. I had genuinely believed in TechFlow's mission and had sacrificed personal relationships, vacation time, and work-life balance to advance the company's interests. The realization that they had been planning my destruction while I worked 18-hour days to save their reputation was devastating. Wei called me Saturday morning to check on my well-being. His concern was genuine, and he was the only person in Singapore who seemed to understand the severity of my situation. "Florence, I have been thinking about what happened yesterday," he said during our coffee meeting near my hotel. "The timing of your termination cannot be coincidental. Your company waited until you had essentially completed the project before cutting you off." His observation helped clarify something that had been nagging at me. TechFlow hadn't fired me because I was failing. They had fired me because I was succeeding. My success threatened their narrative about the project being impossible to salvage, and it exposed their plan to blame me for failures that were never my responsibility. The legal implications became clear when I received an email from Patricia Williams on Monday morning. TechFlow was alleging that I had violated my employment contract by exceeding authorized spending limits and making commitments to clients without proper approval. They were preparing to sue me for breach of contract and demanding that I repay the company for project expenses I had covered with my personal funds. The accusation was so outrageous that I actually laughed out loud in my hotel room. They were claiming that my efforts to save their project constituted a legal violation and they wanted me to reimburse them for money I had spent from my own savings account when they deliberately cut off my corporate funding. But Wei had mentioned something during our Saturday conversation that sparked an idea. He had been secretly recording some of our technical discussions to help document the project restoration process, and those recordings included conversations where the original team members had admitted to taking money from next-gen solutions in exchange for sabotaging the implementation. I wanted to protect myself in case there were questions later about who was responsible for various technical decisions, Wei explained when I asked about the recordings. I have been working in technology long enough to know that documentation is essential when projects become controversial. The recordings were a goldmine of evidence proving the corruption that had occurred before my arrival. They included detailed admissions about the kickback scheme, discussions about deliberately writing faulty code, and conversations about coordinating with next-gen solutions to ensure TechFlow's failure. Wei had unintentionally documented the entire conspiracy. More importantly, the recordings proved that I had inherited a deliberately sabotaged project and had successfully rebuilt it despite systematic opposition from my own company. Any objective analysis would demonstrate that my technical work was exceptional and that TechFlow's accusations against me were completely unfounded. The real breakthrough came when I received an unexpected phone call from David Chen on Tuesday afternoon. "Florence, I hope you don't mind me contacting you directly," he said, his voice carrying a tone of embarrassment. "Megacorp's leadership team has been discussing the situation since Friday, and we have some questions about the project status." David explained that Megacorp was confused about who owned the intellectual property for the system I had developed. Since I had been terminated during the presentation before any final deliverables had been officially transferred, they were uncertain about their legal rights to the code and documentation. "From our perspective," David continued, "you successfully solved problems that your company had been unable to address for 8 months. We are interested in continuing to work with you, but we need to understand the legal framework." The conversation triggered a realization that changed everything. I had been fired before completing the official handover process, which meant that technically I still owned all the intellectual property for the code I had written to fix the project. TechFlow had terminated my employment so abruptly that they had inadvertently cut themselves off from the very work they had sent me to Singapore to complete. Even better, David revealed that Megacorp's leadership was so impressed with my work that they wanted to offer me a direct contract to finish the project as an independent consultant. The proposed compensation was 3 times my previous TechFlow salary, with additional bonuses tied to successful implementation milestones. "We believe you understand our technical requirements better than anyone," David said. "If you are interested in completing this work independently, we would like to discuss terms as soon as possible." Sitting in that Singapore hotel room, I realized that TechFlow's betrayal had accidentally created an opportunity that would never have existed if they had treated me properly. By firing me so precipitously, they had lost their biggest client and handed me the chance to compete against them with insider knowledge of their weaknesses and failures. For the first time since receiving that devastating text message, I smiled genuinely. They had thought abandoning me would destroy my career and leave me financially ruined. Instead, they had freed me to become their most dangerous competitor. Wednesday morning marked the beginning of my transformation from victim to strategic operator. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or scrambling to find a flight home, I calmly analyzed my position and realized that I held significantly more leverage than my former employers understood. My first move was to respond to Richard's termination text with exactly the message he least expected: "Thanks for letting me know." Those 5 words were carefully chosen to convey complete composure while revealing nothing about my actual plans or emotional state. I wanted him to wonder what I was thinking, to worry about what I might do next, and to realize that his attempt to devastate me had failed to achieve the desired psychological impact. Next, I called David Chen and formally accepted Megacorp's offer to complete the project as an independent contractor. The terms were extraordinary: $90,000 for the remaining work, plus performance bonuses that could add another $40,000 if I met accelerated delivery timelines. It was more money than I had ever made in a single quarter, and it came with the added satisfaction of knowing that TechFlow had just lost their most valuable client relationship. The legal framework was surprisingly simple. Since TechFlow had terminated me before I could transfer the intellectual property for my work, I retained ownership of all the code documentation and technical solutions I had developed. Megacorp could license the work directly from me without any involvement from my former employer. Y was instrumental in helping me establish the independent consulting arrangement. His technical expertise and local business knowledge made the transition seamless, and his recorded evidence of the original corruption provided legal protection against any future retaliation from TechFlow. "Florence," he said during one of our planning sessions, "I think your former company made a very serious strategic error. They have given you the opportunity to compete against them while possessing complete knowledge of their internal weaknesses." He was absolutely right. I knew TechFlow's technical capabilities, their pricing strategies, their key personnel, and their operational vulnerabilities. More importantly, I had documented evidence of their unethical business practices and their willingness to sacrifice employees to protect corporate interests. The work itself proceeded incredibly smoothly once I was free from TechFlow's interference. Without the constant pressure to justify my decisions to skeptical managers or work around inadequate resources, I completed the remaining 15% of the project in just 8 days. The final system exceeded every performance benchmark and included several innovative features that Megacorp hadn't originally requested. During this period, I began receiving increasingly desperate communications from my former employer. The first was a formal letter from Patricia Williams demanding that I immediately cease all work on the Megacorp project and return any proprietary information to TechFlow. I responded through my newly hired Singapore attorney, politely explaining that I had no proprietary TechFlow information and that all my work had been developed independently after my termination. The second communication was more revealing. Jennifer from accounting called to inform me that my final paycheck was being held pending resolution of outstanding financial discrepancies related to the Singapore assignment. She claimed that my personal expenses needed to be reviewed and approved before any final payment could be processed. The transparent attempt at financial manipulation actually strengthened my legal position. I had detailed records of every expense I had covered with personal funds, and TechFlow's refusal to honor their payroll obligations violated multiple labor laws. My attorney was delighted to add wage theft to our growing list of potential claims against the company. The most satisfying development was watching TechFlow's stock price begin to decline as news of their problems spread through the technology industry. Losing Megacorp was a significant blow to their revenue projections, but the broader market was starting to question their competence and reliability as vendor. By Friday of my first week as an independent contractor, I learned through industry contacts that 3 other major TechFlow clients were reviewing their relationships and considering alternative vendors. The Megacorp situation had raised questions about the company's ability to deliver complex projects and maintain professional standards. Richard finally called me directly on Saturday morning, his voice carrying a tone of barely controlled panic that I had never heard before. "Florence, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about your Singapore assignment," he began, as if the entire termination had been an administrative error rather than a calculated betrayal. "I don't think there were any misunderstandings," I replied calmly. "Your text message was quite clear about my employment status. Look, we're prepared to discuss bringing you back to the company in a senior role," he continued, apparently believing that a promotion offer would erase the previous week's events. "There's a vice president position opening in our client relations division, and your experience with the Singapore project makes you an ideal candidate." The offer was laughably transparent. TechFlow was realizing that losing me and the megacorp relationship simultaneously had created a crisis they couldn't easily solve. They needed me back to prevent further client defections and to maintain some credibility in the market. That's an interesting offer, I said, but I'm currently focused on completing my consulting commitments. Perhaps we can discuss it after I finish my current projects. I deliberately kept the conversation vague while recording every word through my phone's built-in functionality. Richard's desperation was obvious, and I wanted to document his admission that my termination had been a mistake and that TechFlow was suffering significant consequences. The call ended with Richard promising to send me a formal offer letter with compensation details and requesting that I consider returning to help the company navigate some challenging client situations. The transformation from termination to recruitment had taken exactly 1 week, and it confirmed that my strategic approach was working perfectly. That afternoon, I received the most encouraging news yet. David Chen called to inform me that Megacorp was so impressed with my work that they wanted to discuss a longer-term consulting relationship for additional projects throughout Asia. The initial conversation suggested opportunities worth more than $500,000 over the next 18 months. Florence, your technical expertise and professionalism have exceeded our expectations, David said. We would like to explore expanding our relationship to include other initiatives where your capabilities would be valuable. Sitting in my Singapore hotel room reviewing contract proposals that would transform my financial future while my former employer begged me to return, I realized that the worst professional betrayal of my life had accidentally created the best career opportunity I had ever encountered. The desperation in TechFlow's subsequent communications became increasingly obvious as the scope of their crisis expanded. What had begun as a calculated attempt to sacrifice me for their corporate failures had evolved into an existential threat to the company's survival. Richard's promised offer letter arrived Monday morning via email, and the terms were staggering. They were offering me a senior vice president position with a base salary of $175,000 plus equity compensation that could reach an additional $100,000 annually. The role included oversight of all international client relationships and a seat on the executive management committee. More telling than the compensation was the language describing my responsibilities. The position essentially required me to repair the damage that my termination had caused to client relationships and to rebuild confidence in TechFlow's ability to execute complex projects. They were asking me to fix problems that existed because they had betrayed me in the first place. I forwarded the offer to Wei for his perspective, knowing that his business experience would help me evaluate the proposal objectively. "This is remarkable," he said during our coffee meeting. "They are essentially admitting that firing you was a catastrophic mistake and that their company cannot function without your expertise." He was correct, but there were additional factors that TechFlow didn't understand. While they were desperately trying to convince me to return, I was simultaneously building a competing business that could potentially destroy their market position entirely. The megacorp relationship had opened doors to other opportunities throughout Southeast Asia. David Chen had introduced me to executives at 4 other major corporations that were seeking technology consulting services, and my reputation for solving impossible problems was spreading rapidly through their professional networks. More importantly, I had begun documenting TechFlow's unethical practices in a comprehensive report that could be shared with regulatory authorities, industry publications, and potential clients. The corruption evidence that Wei had recorded, combined with my personal experiences of abandonment and financial manipulation, painted a picture of systematic misconduct that could destroy the company's credibility permanently. Tuesday brought the most satisfying development yet. My attorney received a panicked phone call from Patricia Williams requesting an immediate meeting to discuss resolving any outstanding issues between the parties. The sudden shift from aggressive threats to diplomatic outreach suggested that TechFlow had finally grasped the severity of their legal exposure. The meeting, conducted via video conference with Patricia Richard and TechFlow's Chief Executive Officer, Marcus Thompson, was a masterclass in corporate backpedaling. Marcus, who had never spoken to me directly during my 6 years with the company, opened the conversation with an apology that was clearly scripted by legal counsel. "Florence, we want to acknowledge that there were miscommunications about your Singapore assignment that led to unfortunate outcomes for everyone involved," he began, carefully avoiding any admission of deliberate wrongdoing. "I'm not sure what miscommunications you're referring to," I replied evenly. The text message terminating my employment seemed quite clear. Patricia jumped in to explain that the termination had been premature and that TechFlow was prepared to offer substantial compensation to resolve any concerns I might have about the situation. She outlined a settlement proposal that included restoration of my employment back pay for the period since my termination and reimbursement for all expenses I had incurred in Singapore. The offer was generous, but it missed the fundamental point. I no longer needed TechFlow's employment because I had already built something better independently. Their attempt to buy my silence and cooperation came too late to prevent the consequences of their betrayal. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm currently committed to several consulting projects that require my full attention. Perhaps we can revisit this conversation after I complete those obligations." Marcus's expression darkened as he realized that I was not going to accept their terms unconditionally. "Florence, I hope you understand that competing against your former employer could create legal complications. There are non-compete clauses in your original employment agreement that may restrict your current activities." The threat was poorly calculated. My attorney had already reviewed my employment contract and determined that TechFlow's own termination had invalidated any post-employment restrictions. They couldn't fire me for cause and then claim that I was bound by non-compete provisions. "I believe my attorney has already addressed those concerns in her correspondence with your legal team," I replied calmly. The meeting ended with TechFlow requesting additional time to develop a more comprehensive proposal, and me agreeing to consider any future offers they might present. I knew they would continue escalating their attempts to contain the damage, but I also knew that their options were rapidly diminishing. Wednesday brought news that confirmed my strategic advantage was growing stronger. Wei informed me that 2 TechFlow employees had reached out to him seeking opportunities to join our consulting practice. The employees, both senior developers who had worked on the original Megacorp project, were disgusted by the company's treatment of me and wanted to distance themselves from TechFlow's declining reputation. Even more significant was the information they provided about TechFlow's internal crisis. The company had lost 6 major clients in the past 2 weeks, with several specifically citing concerns about vendor reliability and project management capabilities. Revenue projections for the quarter had been slashed by 40%, and the executive team was considering emergency cost-cutting measures, including significant layoffs. The securities regulators had also begun investigating TechFlow's disclosure practices after receiving information about potential fraud in their client relationship reporting. While I hadn't initiated the investigation directly, my documentation of the Megacorp situation had apparently prompted broader questions about the company's transparency and honesty. Thursday's revelation was the most dramatic yet. David Chen called to inform me that Megacorp had been approached by TechFlow's chief executive officer with a desperate attempt to salvage their relationship. Marcus had flown to Singapore personally to offer massive discounts and service guarantees in exchange for continued business. "He seemed quite distressed," David reported. "He kept mentioning that losing our account would have serious implications for his company's financial stability. He also asked several questions about your current status and whether you might be willing to return to TechFlow to manage our relationship." The image of Marcus begging for business in Singapore while his company collapsed around him was deeply satisfying. The same executive who had approved my termination was now personally traveling across the globe to try to repair the damage that decision had caused. Friday brought the final confirmation that TechFlow's empire was crumbling beyond repair. The Seattle Business Journal published an article titled, Local Tech Firm Faces Client Exodus Following Project Management Scandal, which detailed the company's recent struggles without mentioning my name specifically. The article cited industry sources who described a pattern of poor project execution and questionable business practices that had damaged client relationships. The stock price had dropped 38% since my termination, and financial analysts were questioning whether TechFlow could survive the current crisis without major restructuring or acquisition by a larger firm. That evening, I received the most satisfying communication of the entire ordeal. Richard sent a personal email that abandoned all corporate pretense and spoke directly to the desperation of their situation. Florence, I know you have every right to be angry about how things ended, but I hope you can consider what your decision means for the people who are still here. There are 47 employees whose jobs depend on resolving this crisis, and many of them had nothing to do with the Singapore situation. Please, consider our offer and help us find a way to move forward. The email revealed that TechFlow's leadership finally understood the magnitude of their strategic error. They had sacrificed a valuable employee to protect themselves from a corruption scandal, only to discover that the employee they destroyed was the only person capable of saving their company from the consequences of that scandal. I replied with the same message I had sent after my termination. Thanks for letting me know. 6 months later, I stood in the corner office of my new headquarters in downtown Seattle, looking out at the Puget Sound while reviewing the lease agreement for our second office space. The view was spectacular, but more satisfying was the knowledge that my building was exactly 4 blocks away from TechFlow's rapidly emptying offices. Florence Consulting Solutions had grown from a desperate survival strategy into one of the most successful technology consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest. What began as a single contract with Megacorp had expanded into a portfolio of 23 major clients across 6 countries, with annual revenue approaching $8 million. The team had grown to match our success. Wei had joined as my chief technical officer, bringing his expertise in international implementations and his remarkable ability to build client relationships. The 2 TechFlow refugees who had reached out during my Singapore ordeal were now senior project managers, leading implementations that consistently exceeded client expectations. Our staff of 23 included some of the most talented developers and consultants in the region, many of whom had left competitors to join our growing company. Megacorp's expansion into North America had become our flagship success story. David Chen had been promoted to Regional Director for International Operations, and his testimonial about our work had opened doors throughout the global financial services industry. The project that TechFlow had declared impossible to salvage was now generating $50 million in annual transaction volume and had become a model for similar implementations across 3 continents. The contrast with TechFlow's trajectory was stark and deeply satisfying. The company that had abandoned me in Singapore had lost 68% of its client base and been forced to lay off 31 employees, including several managers who had participated in my termination. Their stock price had never recovered from the crisis that began with the Megacorp situation, and industry analysts regularly cited them as an example of how poor leadership decisions could destroy a previously successful firm. Richard had been terminated 4 months after my firing officially for failing to maintain critical client relationships, but really because the board needed someone to blame for the company's collapse. His departure came too late to save TechFlow's reputation, and his severance package was a fraction of what the company had initially offered to bring me back. Marcus Thompson had managed to keep his job as chief executive officer, but only by accepting a massive reduction in compensation and surrendering most of his decision-making authority to a new board of directors appointed by the private equity firm that had acquired TechFlow at a deeply discounted price. The company I had once respected was now essentially a subsidiary being managed by accountants focused on cost-cutting rather than innovation. The legal resolution had been equally satisfying. TechFlow's new management had settled all my claims for an undisclosed but substantial amount, providing the initial capital that allowed me to expand Florence Consulting Solutions aggressively during our first year. More importantly, the settlement included a formal acknowledgement that my termination had been inconsistent with company policies and professional standards. Patricia Williams had left TechFlow shortly after the settlement, reportedly to start her own practice after being passed over for a promotion that went to an external candidate. Her departure removed the last member of the executive team that had orchestrated my Singapore betrayal, completing the transformation of a company that no longer resembled the organization where I had once worked. The personal growth that resulted from the betrayal had been just as valuable as the professional success. Being abandoned in a foreign country had forced me to discover capabilities and strength that I never knew I possessed. The experience taught me that loyalty to organizations that don't reciprocate that loyalty is not just naive, but potentially destructive to your own interests. More importantly, I learned to value myself appropriately and to demand respect, rather than hoping it would be granted voluntarily. The Florence who had accepted years of being overlooked for promotions while less qualified colleagues advanced would never have had the confidence to build a competing business or to turn down offers from former employers who needed her expertise. My approach to employee relations reflected these lessons. Florence Consulting Solutions operated with complete transparency about compensation, advancement opportunities, and company performance. Every team member had equity in the business and a clear understanding of how their contributions affected our collective success. I was determined to create the kind of workplace I had always wanted to be part of, where loyalty was mutual and success was shared rather than hoarded by executives. The mentorship programs we established had become particularly meaningful. We partnered with local universities to provide internships for women studying technology and business, and we sponsored professional development workshops for mid-career professionals who wanted to transition into consulting. The programs were partly inspired by my own experience of being undermined and abandoned, and they represented my commitment to helping others avoid similar betrayals. The international expansion that began with Megacorp had evolved into our most exciting growth opportunity. We now had permanent offices in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Sydney, with plans to enter the European market within the next 18 months. The global reach that TechFlow had failed to achieve through 8 years of effort we had accomplished in less than 2 years by focusing on client relationships and technical excellence, rather than corporate politics and cost-cutting. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. TechFlow's betrayal, which was intended to destroy my career and protect their corporate interests, had instead launched me into a level of professional success that would never have been possible as their employee. They had inadvertently freed me from limitations I hadn't even realized existed and forced me to discover entrepreneurial capabilities that had been dormant during years of traditional employment. The most satisfying moment came during a technology industry conference in San Francisco, where I was invited to deliver a keynote presentation about building resilient consulting practices. The audience included several former TechFlow colleagues, including 2 managers who had participated in the decision to terminate my employment. During the question and answer session, one of them asked about maintaining client relationships during periods of organizational transition, obviously hoping I would offer insights they could use to address TechFlow's ongoing struggles. My response was professional but pointed. The most important factor in maintaining client relationships is consistent delivery of value and honest communication, I said, looking directly at him while speaking to the broader audience. Clients can forgive technical problems and budget overruns, but they will never forgive being deceived or abandoned. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. The message was clear to everyone who understood the context. and the former colleague's uncomfortable expression confirmed that he recognized the implications for his own situation. As I concluded my presentation that day, I shared the lesson that had emerged from my Singapore experience. Sometimes the worst professional betrayals become the greatest gifts because they force you to discover strength and capabilities you never knew you possessed. They teach you to depend on yourself rather than on the goodwill of others, and they clarify the difference between organizations that deserve your loyalty and those that will exploit it. The standing ovation that followed felt like vindication for everyone who had ever been undervalued, abandoned, or betrayed by employers who claimed to care about their welfare. It was recognition that success achieved through resilience and determination is more meaningful than success granted by others, and that the greatest revenge against betrayal is building something so successful that your betrayers realize exactly what they threw away. Today, as I review proposals for our next phase of international expansion, I often think about that text message Richard sent from 12,000 miles away. "We're going to fire you. You're on your own." He intended those words to devastate me, to leave me isolated and defeated in a foreign country with no resources or support. Instead, they became the most liberating words I had ever received. They freed me from the illusion that corporate loyalty was reciprocal, from the belief that hard work alone would be rewarded, and from the fear of taking risks that traditional employment had instilled in me. They thought abandoning me would destroy me. Instead, it freed me to become who I was always meant to be, an entrepreneur, a leader, and someone who creates opportunities rather than waiting for them to be provided by others. The greatest revenge isn't destruction of those who betrayed you. It's building something so successful that they realize exactly what they lost when they chose to throw you away. It's proving that their assessment of your value was wrong and that their decision to abandon you was the biggest strategic error they ever made. Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize you never needed them in the first place. Have you ever experienced a moment when betrayal at work actually opened doors to better opportunities? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below about how you turned professional setbacks into career breakthroughs. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that like button to show your support for everyone who's had to rebuild after being abandoned by employers they trusted. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming workplace challenges and building the career you truly deserve. And please share this with anyone who might need to hear that sometimes the worst professional betrayals become the greatest gifts in disguise. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I hope it inspires you to recognize your own worth and never settle for organizations that don't value what you bring to the table. Remember, your greatest success story might be waiting just beyond your biggest disappointment.